Hi everyone, this is another rant sort of video. I'm calling it 5 things I thought all tuners knew, because I guess I'm surprised when I discovered that tuners don't know them. You could probably make some no true Scotsman type argument and say that, well, if they didn't know this then they're not a real tuner anyway, but I don't want to get into an argument about who's a real tuner and who isn't. As I've said in other videos, we're all here to learn all the time, so if you don't know these things already then I hope it helps. Now that related to each other in any way, except for their 5 things that I happen to have noticed since my last rant. Okay, the first one is really basic. It goes back to high school science stuff, and it's the definition of pressure, how it's measured and how people describe it. So pressure is an absolute. If you have 0 pressure, then it means that you have a perfect vacuum. Atmospheric pressure is about 100 kPa at sea level, and 100 kPa is 100,000 newtons per square metre, which means that if you have an area that's 1 square metre, and you have an atmosphere on one side of it, then it's pushing that square metre with a force of equivalent to about 10 tonnes. So why is this plastic bottle not crushed by all the force of the atmosphere forcing on the outside? Well, the answer is that it's because you've got the same atmospheric pressure on the inside forcing the plastic out. So there's no actual crushing, if you know what I mean. You can actually see this if you go on planes a bit. You can go up to a high altitude, open the bottle, so it equalises with the high altitude air, close the bottle. When you come back to room pressure, you'll find that it's being crushed in by the force of the atmosphere. Now, because atmospheric pressure is around us all the time, we don't even notice it. And often when we have a positive pressure, so boost or a partial vacuum, then actually what we care about is the difference between atmospheric pressure and this new slightly higher or slightly lower pressure. For example, if you imagine a wastegate actuator, you've got a diaphragm, which one side's open to atmosphere, and boost comes in the other side. So what causes that diaphragm to deflect is the fact that the boost pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure. So what we care about is how much higher that pressure is than the atmospheric pressure. So we call this gauge pressure, which is the difference between a certain pressure and the atmosphere. Now, I assume that it's called gauge pressure because if you have a pressure gauge, the way it works is with such a diaphragm that deflects a needle, which means that if you're at atmospheric pressure, there's no deflection, so it'll read 0. So many pressures are traditionally measured as gauge pressures. So tyre pressure, for example, or oil pressure, it measures gauge pressures because you measure them with a gauge, and that's what we care about. Now, absolute pressure is the pressure relative to a perfect vacuum. So that actually tells you the real pressure, if you like. And if you're trying to calculate how much mass of a certain gas there is in a certain volume, that's what you care about. You care about the actual pressure, not the pressure relative to the atmosphere or something else. So in the ideal gas equation, PV equals nRT, P pressure is an absolute pressure, and also T is an absolute temperature as it happens. So when you're trying to calculate the mass of air in a certain volume, then it's absolute pressure that you care about. And that's why in tuning, you care about the absolute pressure in the elect manifold. That's MAP, manifold absolute pressure. The A stands for absolute because you care about the absolute pressure. Now, in some cases, what we actually care about is a pressure differential. So in the earlier example I gave with the wastegate actuator, where you've got atmosphere on one side and boost on the other, on most higher spec actuators, shall we say, you'll have a port on each side. And it's actually the pressure difference between the two that determines how far the actuator moves. So this means, for example, that you need to be really careful when you're talking about certain variables like fuel pressure, because if you're measuring the fuel pressure with a gauge, then it's going to tell you the gauge pressure. And if you're trying to work out how good your seals need to be, or how much pressure your pump needs to be able to provide, then gauge pressure is actually what you care about, because the fuel pump sucks in fuel at atmospheric pressure because the fuel tank is not pressurized. However, what the injector sees is it sees fuel pressure on one side and manifold air pressure on the other side. So it's actually the differential pressure, so the pressure drop across the injector, that the injector cares about. So when referring to fuel pressure, you need to be really careful about whether you're talking about the gauge pressure or the differential pressure. This gets even more complicated when manifold pressure is measured as an absolute, whereas fuel pressure is measured as a gauge. So you actually need to subtract or add, depending on which way you're going, the barometric pressure to be able to work out the differential fuel pressure from those two. Okay, the second point I'm going to talk about is being able to do the minimum required to replicate the problem. Surprised I need to say this, it seems that I do. I'm going to do a whole video at some point on how to diagnose and troubleshoot any problem and the process that I go through when I'm stumped, which all goes back to high school, which everyone's forgotten. But the point is that if you have a problem that replicates under gentle conditions, shall we say, then that's the condition under which you try to replicate it. So if you've got a trigger-related misfire, for example, and it happens regardless of load, then you shouldn't be trying to replicate it at full load once you've determined that's what it is. If you replicate it at light load and you have an ignition pulse that happens at the wrong time because you've got a trigger error, then the engine's going to be very forgiving of that compared to if you're doing it on a lot of boost. And it's really sad that I've seen people unnecessarily destroy engines because you're not following this basic principle. Okay, the third one is rotary ignition timing. So rotaries have 2 spark plugs per rotor. The bottom one is called the leading plug and the top one's called the trailing plug. Now in the normal ignition map, that sets the timing for the leading plug. There's a second map called the spark split, and the trailing plug's timing is taken from the leading plug timing minus the split. So for example, if you have in your ignition map 25 degrees before top dead center, and your split map you have 10 degrees, that means that the trailing plug will fire at 15 degrees before top dead center. Now, top dead center is defined as in the same definition as a piston engine, which is the minimum clearance volume. I know this is further complicated by the fact that certainly on the 13Bs, they do not have a timing mark from factory at TDC. The FCs have one at 5 degrees after and another one at 20 degrees after, and the FD only had the one at 20 degrees after top dead center. Now, a further complication is that you can actually run negative split. So the RX-8 engine, for example, from factory runs negative split at idle. In other words, it fires the trailing plugs before the leading plugs. Now, in this case, for example, if you have 5 degrees in the main ignition map and minus 10 in the split map, it means that the trailing plugs will be firing at 15 degrees before top dead center. So it's actually going to be the trailing plugs that begin the combustion, if you like, and the combustion will actually start at 15 degrees before top dead center, even though you've got 5 degrees in the ignition map. But changing the definitions based on whether one number is positive or negative will make things very complicated and confusing, so we don't do that. Okay, number 4. There seems to be this misconception out there that if you have a misfire, you'll get a rich reading from an oxygen sensor. I don't know where this started. An oxygen sensor measures oxygen. It measures leftover oxygen from combustion. Combustion starts with a hydrocarbon or carbohydrate if you're burning ethanol, and that combines with oxygen to produce carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide and water. Now, if you have an excess of oxygen at the beginning, then you're going to have an excess of oxygen left over. Combustion is never complete, so there'll always be some oxygen left over, and the richer the mixture is, the less oxygen gets left over at the end, and that's what an oxygen sensor measures. So if you have a misfire, for whatever reason, unless you put your hand over the engine that can't suck in any oxygen at all, for any other reason, if it's still sucking oxygen into the engine, then you're going to have a lot of oxygen left over, so you'll actually get a false lean reading from the oxygen sensor. Now, often it'll be too fast for you to be able to see, especially if it's a short misfire, because most oxygen sensor controllers are not very fast. But regardless, if you, say, drop a cylinder for a long period of time, then you're going to get a leaner mixture displayed than the actual mixture. Now, this is the case even if you have a rich misfire. So if it's so rich that it doesn't fire, it means that you still have a lot of oxygen left over, and that'll be picked up by the oxygen sensor. Now, this last one is sort of a tiny bit related to the previous one, and that is when people say, it's backfiring, I think it's running rich. Well, let's start by talking about the definition of backfiring. It used to mean a fire back up the intake, that is, combusting while the intake valves open up through the carburetor. But often people, I think, now refer to it as a combustion that happens in the exhaust, so a pop or a bang in the exhaust, that sort of thing. And that usually does not mean that the mixture is too rich, in my experience. When I say that, I say I've never seen a case where a too rich mixture has caused an exhaust backfire. I've seen it plenty of times with a lean mixture though. The reason is that if the mixture is too lean and you get a lean miss, then you still have some unburnt petrol and air in the exhaust, which can still burn when it hits something hot like exhaust gas escaping from an adjacent cylinder, or a turbine, or a hot exhaust valve, or something like that. So it's normally a lean mixture for the simple reason that if there's a rich mixture, there's very little oxygen left over to actually allow combustion to occur. The only way that it could burn is if it gets all the way to the tailpipe and then mixes with the air from the outside, and you get a flame actually at the tailpipe. Now, that can happen, but in most cases, unless it's been on fire the whole way down the exhaust, it's too cold by the time it gets to the exhaust to actually spontaneously ignite. I know some people put spark plugs in their exhaust tips and that sort of thing, and good luck to them. I'm not talking about that sort of situation. Now, I'll admit that this last one is based on my own experience rather than any theory, but I've had plenty of times when tuners have told me that they think it's too rich on overrun, and I've put more fuel in and the backfiring has stopped. So if you've got different experiences, then I'd love to hear about them. Maybe there are others where it has been too rich, they've taken fuel out and the problem's gone away, and I just don't get to hear about them when that happens. Now, of course, if you turn on overrun fuel cut, then you don't actually get this occur in the first place, but there are some conditions where you can't do that for whatever reason, so that's why I think it's an important thing to bring up. Thank you very much.